All right, well, good morning, everybody. I want to welcome you all to the next edition of FSMA Fridays, the January 2018. Happy New Year to everybody. Thanks for coming back. We've got a nice full house today. A lot of familiar names, got a few new ones, which is great. And got a great presenter from our friends over at the Acheson Group to join us today, which I'll be introducing here in just a moment. But we got a lot of great content, so we want to jump right in today. For those of you that are new, and we had a lot of new signups over the past month or two since we had our last session in the holidays there. So the idea behind this is really it's been the longest standing industry update in and around topics related to FSMA. So we have a format that's really somewhat informal, but we try and talk about what's going on in the world of FSMA and anything related to it. So we have a little bit of a news update, kind of trending topics since our last session. We also dig into any regulation changes and updates and trends, but we also spend some time around a particular topic each month, and this month in particular, we're going to dig into food defense, which is a hot topic for sure and on a lot of people's minds with some of the changes coming into 2018. And usually one of the highlights is obviously the opportunity to engage with our partners at the Acheson Group, and so I think we'll have a lot to cover and some really great questions, and as always, we'll do our best to get to as many of those as we can. The FSMA Friday event has been going on for, I think we're going on 6 years now, is sponsored by our friends over at the Acheson Group, great partners of ours, recognized certainly as the leaders in global food and beverage safety consulting, and goes without saying that we are very, very pleased to have them join us and lead this discussion each month. And on the flip side, on the technology side, we're here at SafetyChain, and we're food quality management software, so we specialize in reducing cost, waste, and risk for food companies. And you'll hear more about at the end both if there's a way we can help you on either side of the consulting or the technology. Certainly would love to have a conversation around that. A couple things to keep in mind as we go through in terms of the format. As I said, we kind of have more of an informal kind of news update and get into a topic. We try to be conversational and informal. These are serious topics, but try not to take ourselves that serious. We may even have fun from time to time, so be careful. Encourage you to ask questions. We get a lot during these sessions. We have a team behind the scenes that are monitoring those. We certainly do our best. We'll probably save those for the end, but we will also take any offline and into our FSMA Friday LinkedIn group, which is a great place to continue the conversation afterward. You'll notice also that as you ask questions, you'll see that the panelists are the only ones displayed. So you can send all of that to us directly, and there's a little Q&A box up there. There's also a chat box if you want to reach to us directly if you have maybe a technical issue. Usually the biggest question, or one of the most common, is how do I get the recording link? So yes, we are recording, and we always share the replay with everybody. So if you want to check back to it later, share with a colleague. We'll usually have those out in a few days after the session, so probably early to middle of next week. And if there's any audio issues or technical issues, we have some of our team behind the scenes here that'll monitor any chat that comes in from that. We'll do our best. Usually with all technology, the magic of logging out, logging in, or just changing your audio option. You can log in using your computer audio or your phone audio. So if one of those is giving you a challenge, always recommend just maybe switching that over there. So again, as what we'll be covering, we'll talk some news and updates. We're going to focus on food defense this month, and also get to Q&A that we've been watching in the forum, as well as anything that will be coming in over the course of our conversation here. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our guest presenter from the Acheson Group this month, which is Dr. Rolando Gonzalez. He's the Senior Director of Technical and Scientific Affairs. And I asked him for an in-depth bio because I think with this topic, it was really exciting to see how much background he has. So Dr. Gonzalez has technical and thought leadership roles at major national and global companies, including Target, Buehler AG, 3M, Food Safety, just to name a few. He has advanced training in microbiology, food science, and public health. And Dr. Gonzalez brings well over a decade of domestic and international practical food safety and quality management experience. He's covered a variety of food platforms from perishables to dry and low moisture foods. but his real focus has been around risk mitigation and brand protection. Dr. Gonzalez has been heavily engaged in food defense efforts since 9/11, training soon after in preventing deliberate attacks to the food supply with nationally recognized leading experts at AIB and the U.S. Department of Homeland Defense's Food Protection and Defense Institute. Over the last decade, he's facilitated and delivered training on the basic principles and best industry practices for preventing and managing threats to the food supply, which have more recently included the FDA food defense expectations under FSMA, which is what we're here to talk about today. So Dr. Gonzalez is a registered environmental health sanitarian and a lead instructor, FSPCA, for both Human and Animal U.S. Food Safety Modernization Act, Preventative Control Rules. So with all of that said, Dr. Gonzalez, and he gave me permission to call him Rolando, but we appreciate you being here and want to make sure you can hear us okay.
I can hear you very well, Brian. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and good morning to the FSMA Fridays audience. Very happy to be back at FSMA Fridays.
Yeah, we're glad to have you back, and we were just chatting. We've had you join us from everywhere from Shanghai, but today you are in the great city of Minneapolis, I believe, correct?
Correct. That is correct.
All right. Very, very good. And we'll save you the bio on the other one. You can just call me the other guy. So let's get into the good stuff here. So we had a little bit of an extended break because FSMA Fridays was kind of during the holidays. So it's been almost 6 weeks since we got an update from you guys. So just in general, Rolando, what's going on? Anything newsworthy that might be on the minds of the folks out there and that you want to share with us?
Yeah, absolutely, Brian. So a number of topics here from a updates standpoint. The agency has certainly been active for the past 30 days or so in releasing guidance, and there's at least 7 of those documents that we're aware of. First one, from a human food processors and manufacturers perspective, they released the 15th chapter of the HARP-C guidance. And that's designed, that particular one is designed to help the food facilities comply with the supply chain program requirements under the Preventative Controls Rule for human food. In the case of animal food, they also released the first part of the guidance, the first 5 chapters for that industry. So that, I mean, those are definitely being useful in clarifying what the requirements are and how companies can comply with the requirements there. There have been multiple other guidance documents that they released in the past month or so, and those are providing clarification and better understanding of the requirements of the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. And that, you know, those are good resources. In fact, I have to say, from a tax perspective, we've seen the first 483 that was issued to one importer because they didn't have a Foreign Supplier Verification Program. So some companies, again, have had some challenges in you know, understanding and meeting those requirements. So it's good to see that the agency has come forward and provided that guidance. There was another one that they released also. It's in relation to enforcement discretion that they plan to use for some of the elements of 4 of the rules. That is the Preventative Controls Rule for human food, for animal food, the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, and the Produce Safety Rule. We don't have time to go over you know, all the different discretion items that they listed, but just to give you an example, in all those 4, there have been the requirement for written assurances between suppliers and customers, and they've realized that for some of the industries, that's more of a burden than what they planned for. So they've gone back into some rulemaking and, you know, deciding associated with that and what are the resources that the industry will need to comply with those. So again, very active on the guidance document release fashion. And then there is one more thing that I want to mention as far as news. Today, it's the compliance deadline for the sprouts industry. So at least for the small farms, if we recall, they have different requirements and they have no additional time to comply with the water requirements under the Produce Safety Rule. So today is it's the requirement, I mean, the deadline to comply for small farms. For other produce items, so non-sprouts, today is the deadline for large farms, and in their case, they do have extra time to comply with the water requirements. So that's what I can think of from a newsy update related to FSMA.
just off the top of your head, it sounds like it's been a busy few weeks. So,
it's been a busy few weeks, but yeah, I think it's going to be beneficial to the industry for sure.
Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate you touching on all of that. And as always, if you have some questions on anything, he mentioned a lot of resources and a lot of updates and guidance docs. He's put together a really wonderful slide with quick access to a lot of these resources that we'll share at the end there. So we'll make sure everyone gets a copy of that. So when talking to you, Rolando, about what would be a timely topic to focus on for this particular month, we talked about food defense. And I know, obviously, a topic you're really passionate about. And so we have a few things that you were going to cover here today. So I'll let you kind of first touch on a little bit around adulteration rules and food defense, and then an interesting story I think you have to share here.
Yes. Yeah, Brian, so definitely, I mean, the Intentional Adulteration Rule it's one of the 7, obviously, one of the 7 pillars of FSMA. And what it does is it comes out with the requirements that the industry needs to follow to prevent or significantly minimize any acts of intentional or deliberate contamination of the food supply that will have or could potentially have wide-scale public health impact. It does use kind of a similar approach to what we know as HACCP and obviously what we know as the Preventative Controls for human and animal food approach, but it does have some significant differences as well. Similar to those, though, it is risk-based, so it should be risk-based, and it's also flexible. It does provide more flexibility than the Preventative Controls Rule for human and animal food. Is not as resource-intensive. So companies shouldn't have, I mean, many of the efforts that they already have placed into ensuring food safety in their operations likely will have some impact in their ability to comply with this one. But one thing to keep in mind here is, when we talk about food defense versus food safety, so we're talking specifically, and that is the focus of the rule, intentional contamination. So events of intentional contamination of food with the intent to cause harm to public health. There are other definitions such as food safety, food security. Sometimes we do use those interchangeably. They're not the same thing, so we're referring to different items there. And there will be another slide where we'll talk also about food fraud, which is also not the focus of this particular rule. You did mention the story, and then we have a photo there of an individual.
So what's the connection there? I know you kind of left us hanging. You got a good story. So how does this connect to food defense here?
Absolutely, nice story. That well, I don't know if it's so nice, but significant and relevant story to the world of food defense. It's actually a textbook type of incident that happened back in 1984 in this small town in Oregon, the Dalles. It is supposed or considered to be one of the first, if not the first, incident of a bioterror attack to our food supply. And what happened was this person in the photo, he was one of the leaders of these Res Nishi cult in this small town, and they wanted to impact the outcome of an election, a local election, where they wanted their leaders to be the winners of the election. And the means that they used to do that was to make a lot of people sick. So in this case, obviously, a political motivation. And they did that by contaminating salad bars at about 10 restaurants in the town using salmonella. So they went there, sprayed salmonella over the food items in those salad bars, and then there were approximately 750 people get sick with that from that incident. So actually there was a Forensic Files episode that was recorded back in 2014 highlighting the details of that incident. So that's why I wanted to bring it up. It's an example of how many multiple different motivations could lead to an event like this. In this case, it was political, but it could also be a disgruntled employee. It could be an insider. Just keep that in mind when we talk about vulnerability assessments and so forth.
Right. That definitely opens up where all the different, like you said, the motivations that it can be. So let's talk about the regulatory side and food defense, and I know this is where you spend a lot of your time. So The question here is really around, what is the approach? What's the current approach here that you're seeing?
Absolutely. So from a regulatory perspective, and we had to step back a little bit and talk also about, in food defense, just like in food safety, we talk about hazards. In food defense, we like to refer to as vulnerabilities. So the agency, from an FDA perspective, and some of the other regulatory agencies, of course, in this case it's FDA because we're focusing on FSMA, they're looking for companies to assess any potential vulnerabilities in their food manufacturing handling operations. So, because the agency, of course, has conducted many of these assessments over the years, they have a ton of experience in that area, and they have identified 4 different activities that represent the highest risk, or the highest risk for an employee or an insider outsider to contaminate the food supply at some point in the chain, so particularly manufacturing operations. And those are listed there in that slide. So bulk liquid receiving, loading, liquid storage, any secondary ingredient handling, any mixing, any of those activities where food is exposed in a large amount and, employees could have open access to those areas. Obviously, they regard those as highest risk. So, and we'll talk about the elements of what's required under the rule later, but this is what the agency is looking for companies to focus on, those vulnerabilities, and in particular, looking at those those 4 items listed there. Companies can choose to do a more extensive, more detailed vulnerability assessment as well and come up with 50 or 100 items that they need to look at. But the intent of the rule is for companies to be focused in terms of identifying mitigation strategies eventually. And this is a totally acceptable approach to just look at those 4 to start with, and that should give them a good idea of, well, what those vulnerabilities are.
That's great. And you mentioned this is a good place to start. You've done this a long time, you've seen a lot. I mean, how has it changed? How has it changed, as an industry really over the years?
Great question, Brian, and I have to say as well, I mean, food defense obviously didn't start with the rule, the rule under FSMA. The USDA has been requiring this for a while, and those efforts have been going on for many years now. What I see as a difference is, well, first of all, it wasn't, from an FDA perspective, it wasn't mandatory in the past. It was a nice to have, and some of the, not only regulatory, but some of the industry standards as well. Like SQF, they also require it. So now it is mandatory. The other thing that I have seen is over the years, companies the approach was more broad in terms of, again, looking at what are those potential actionable steps, those vulnerable areas, while now the FDA is requiring that companies become more focused in terms of the approach and in looking for those higher risks. So remember, it was risk-based, as FSMA is. So I think those are the two main differences that I see from the previous approach. In the past, again, we used to look more at fences and gates and, cameras. Those still have a role today in the overall strategy, but perhaps access control is also becoming, more important today.
Right. Yeah, that certainly. Right. That makes a lot of sense. So. Moving from regulatory, let's talk about who's covered and what dates apply here. And you've got some good detail up here that would probably be great to clarify and update for everybody.
Absolutely, no, great question as well. So it's from a who's covered standpoint. So just like most of the rules under FSMA, you have to be registered with the FDA to be covered by it. So facilities that are not registered, that are not required to register with FDA, will not be covered. If you are, then you're covered. So facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or whole human food. It does apply to domestic and foreign facilities, so this is not just based on the U.S. Any facilities exporting to the U.S. will have to comply as well. And yes, there are some exemptions, particularly if you're a small business like less than $10 million per year, then you're not covered, you're exempt. If you are over $10 million, then you're covered. But other exemptions include, for example, the animal food producers, handlers and producers. Any operations covered under the produce safety rule, alcoholic beverages as well. Farms are not covered. So those are some of the exemptions that apply. Now, in terms of compliance dates, 3 years since the time that the rule was published for large businesses, and those are listed there in the slide, 4 years and 5 years depending on the size of your business.
Okay. And you mentioned exemptions, Rolando. What about like restaurants, food service? Are they covered?
Yes, they're not covered because, again, they're not required to register with the FDA. So those will be exempt, as are farms, for example, as well.
Okay. All right. Got it. Perfect. All right. So moving on, let's talk, this has obviously been big in the media, and appropriately you've put a slide in here with a newspaper cover, food fraud. And how is this kind of rolling in and part of food defense strategy here?
Yeah, absolutely, Brian. So, it's a common question that we get at TAG as well. When we talk about food fraud, in that case, the main purpose it's economic gain, right? So for some economic benefits. And we don't, in that case, obviously you can see the clear difference between that and what we said was the definition of food defense. In that case, we do want to cause public health harm. In this case, you don't want to do that necessarily. In fact, it's just to gain some additional margin, I guess, from the product or ingredient that you're selling. So the focus of the Intentional Adulteration Rule is not EMA. So EMA is not covered under this rule, but it is actually covered under the Preventative Controls Rule for human food. That is where it's addressed. So in that case, the requirement is for a hazard analysis to consider the potential for economically motivated adulteration as well.
Okay. And is there any connection to, public health when you talk about food fraud? Should we be thinking about it differently, from what you see out there in the field?
There are some cases, and in history we've seen some cases where a company trying to substitute an ingredient for something else that is cheaper from their perspective, but then it turns out that it's an allergen, for example. And then in that case, then without knowing that that we're going to cause harm, then that's where EMA could have some impact in terms of public health. It is typically, catched early in the process and typically addressed. So not, not really the cause of many recalls or significant outbreaks of disease out there, but yes, it could at some point have some impact in terms of public health.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you for clarifying there. So. Kind of moving on now about getting ready, right? The preparation side of things, and how suggestions you have or best practices you have for getting ready for compliance.
Yes, right. So definitely, making sure that companies are conducting those vulnerability assessments or using the key activity types approach that we just talked about. That will be a first item that they need to take care of, because then that will lead to them being able to identify, okay, what are focus mitigation strategies that we can implement against those, right, to prevent them or significantly minimize their impact, their occurrence, and their potential impact. In addition to that, companies then have to devise management strategies around those, which include monitoring, so what frequency, how am I going to monitor that, corrective actions if there is evidence that those mitigation strategies are not being implemented properly, and verification that everything else above is working as it should. And that also includes a reanalysis of the food defense plan with some frequency. Just like in any of the other rules within FSMA, records are critical. So if you didn't write it down, it's considered that you never did it. So records are critical. And then also training. So training, the agency highlights the need for training, particularly for those employees that are in charge of implementing and monitoring and managing those mitigation strategies. There is also requirements, in terms of awareness and some of the requirements from a supervisory standpoint, and whomever is writing the food defense plan and identifying those vulnerabilities and stuff may have additional training requirements. But yeah, that's the general approach. Like I said before, many of the approaches that are followed to get ready for compliance with food safety requirements will get you into into a good place to be compliant with from a food defense standpoint as well.
Right, and what's often on the mind of a lot of people that are listening today, you know, this is a lot, right? So when you talk about compliance with the IA rule, is this, you know, as you meet with a new client, is this something where they should be bracing themselves for a pretty big, you know, economic burden to handle this, or is it kind of a step-by-step, or how do you advise people to be thinking about this as they prepare for compliance?
Very fair question as well, Brian, and I have to say that if you follow the correct approach and you're focusing on those higher risk elements of your operation and identifying those focus mitigation strategies, you shouldn't see a huge impact from an economic standpoint to your operation. That comes about when again, you start looking at things at the whole world and trying to boil the ocean with solutions here and there. If you focus on what the really critical aspects of the operation that could lead to someone, you know, contaminating the food supply, then you shouldn't really see a huge impact from an economic standpoint.
Okay, that's good. Boy, that's good advice all the way around for sure. So. As we wrap up here, what should we expect this year from the FDA? What should we be looking for?
Yeah, and you're not, from a food defense standpoint, Brian, we're not going to see much, you know, enforcement action, obviously, yet this year, because the first compliance deadline will be due next year. But what the approach that we know and that we've heard directly from the FDA is that they're going to follow a pure approach, so they're not going to start day one, so on July 26th of 2019, going to all companies and doing all the comprehensive, very detailed food defense inspections, but they might start with something more like, okay, from those that are, you know, all the companies that are registered out there, let's take a look at their food defense plans to see whether they have one, whether they have the required elements, you know, the basic elements. Eventually, of course, they will figure out which are the highest risk ones. So that tier one will get probably the more comprehensive inspections first before they move into a more widespread enforcement with all the, you know, the details of the law. Right.
All the more reason to start planning and preparing now, which is what you guys do such a great job of, and we really appreciate, Rolando, you put together some valuable resources here. So we'll make sure and get these both up on the LinkedIn group, and we'll also include this along with the replay when we send that out in the next few days. But anything you want to just touch on with these resources here that people should know about?
Yeah, Brian, so I mean, definitely great resources out there. Obviously, number one would be the FDA website and the FSMA section of that. So it does have a copy of the rule and some of the fact sheets and some summarized information. But there is some, you know, additional resources. Some of them are theirs as well. They've been, for years, they've had resources out there that they are updating. There is the Food Defense Plan Builder. There is a Mitigation Strategies database. So I know that they're working on those, and we'll probably update those, hopefully, before the first compliant deadline. There is also the Food Safety Preventative Controls Alliance, great resources out there, particularly through the Technical Assistance Network. You can send questions to them and they'll get back to you. And then there is also other resources such as the Food Protection and Defense Institute at the University of Minnesota. Great resources. There is a link there. Companies can explore that. And then there is always, you know, external experts like TAG out there, which are very willing to help companies and are out there all the time looking at multiple different operations so they can provide companies with the best practices and you know, input from multiple operations on how this is being approached in the field.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. And while we got a couple minutes left for questions, again, we'll make sure and carry over as much as we can into the LinkedIn group. But just maybe one or two I'm going to throw out here, Rolando, if you've got a moment.
Sure.
Question that came in here is a good one. It says, is FDA putting more emphasis on the term preventative controls as opposed to HARP-C?
Well, and to be honest with you, the HARP-C term, Brian, was not coined by the FDA. This was more of the industry trying to, you know, find a way to better handle this long thing about preventive controls and risk, or hazard analysis and preventive controls from a risk-based perspective. I don't know that they're putting more emphasis in either one of them, but the official term is, again, Preventative Controls, particularly for when we talk about Preventative Controls rule for human and animal food. In this case, remember, we're talking more about vulnerabilities and mitigation strategies from a food defense standpoint.
Good. Good to know what the official one is and stick with that, right? So
yes,
this is a great question because it's very timely. It says, I recently saw that GFSI is now requiring a food fraud assessment and a mitigation plan as of the first of the year. How does this work into the FSMA food defense plan?
Yeah, so what we've seen, Brian, is that if you are, and TAG was actually instrumental in conducting some of the comparisons between multiple GFSI schemes out there and the requirements of FSMA. And what we've seen in general is that if you are certified under any of these schemes, you're very close, 80–90% close to meeting the requirements of the of FSMA, with some exceptions, of course. So you still have to take a look and help the auditor understand how you are meeting those. But yes, it is true. Some of the schemes under GFSI are requiring that you conduct food fraud assessments as well as having a food defense plan in place. So if you have one for GFSI, very likely that you will be meeting the requirements of FSMA as well.
Right. Awesome. And all part of that just starting to prepare now, right? Which is
absolutely
what you're talking about here and what you do every day. So again, some really great questions. I know there's a few we didn't get to, but out of the respect of everyone's time, we do want to make sure we let you get on with your day. Join us if you have not. We have a great LinkedIn group. Just go to LinkedIn, search for FSMA Friday. And you'll find our group and just click to join there, and we post follow-up links, extra questions there that Rolando and the TAG team will jump into, and encourage you to engage with us there as well. And we certainly encourage you to reach right out to them directly. So obviously we're very lucky to have them join us and provide some wisdom each and every month. This is what they do every day. So whether it's around food defense or anything else in the area of safety plans and FSMA and compliance, reach out to them at achesongroup.com. And I will also add my own personal part here is that they have a ton of resources there. So I would add this also to the resources that we're going to share from that other slide. They got a lot of really great content there to pull from. And on the technology side, we talked about some of the ways to ease the burden, if you will, of managing all this compliance, and that's really what we do here on the technology side. So we would certainly love to chat with you if you are looking to improve that process. And got some pretty exciting things we're working on here at SafetyChain around food quality management software. So with that, we will have our next FSMA Friday on Friday, February 23rd, and we'll follow up, as we mentioned, with the recording. We've also got a new series kicking off called Beyond Compliance, which just actually started yesterday with a really great showing, and we'll have some other goodies coming out from ourselves and TAG to keep your eyes open for. So Dr. Gonzalez, thank you so much. This was great. You packed in a ton. I don't know how you did all that in that short time, but thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it.
A pleasure as always, Brian.
Yes, and thanks to all of our FSMA Friday folks. Have a wonderful, safe weekend, and we'll see you next month.